Could you explain the Sunni-Shia divide? What is the main issue there?
What, historically or now? Historically. The Sunni-Shia divide is a division for the heritage of the Prophet Muhammad.
The political succession.
It's a political dispute over the succession. That is what it is. The people who are now Shias said that the Caliph who replaced Muhammad should have been Ali, his son-in-law, married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima, but that the others argued that the Prophet had always said that the successor should be chosen by the Ummah, the community as a whole. Well, the community as a whole did meet, and they didn't vote for Ali. They voted for Umar, who succeeded him, and it was a very gifted political leader and military leader. So probably the right decision was made. And then these internal internecine rivalries produced divisions, and Muhammad's grandsons, Ali's grandsons, sons were then encouraged to rebel against the legal caliph. They were encouraged to rebel, and he did what most rulers do, is wipe out a rebellion. And that then became the big thing, that the Prophet's grandchildren, or one, the grandson, Hussein, has been killed. The other wasn't killed at all. He was basically, lived and died a normal death. He lived in Medina. He was not even punished. And accepted the caliphate, but these people then carried on a fight. So it was essentially a struggle for power that developed these. And then once you have this division early on in a faith, it is reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. So that was the early origins of it. And of course they have their different customs, different interpretations of the religion. Some of them are so esoteric that it's not best to discuss them on a family show. But these have then carried on, and now, often, till Khomeini's revolution, the differences were greatly exaggerated, and then the victory of the Iranian Revolution brought this up again. But one should remember that Khomeini's victory was welcomed by Muslims everywhere, Sunni and Shia. But the use of this particular faction of Islam has meant that the Saudi monarchs and the Gulf states are very nervous, because in Bahrain 80% of the population are Shia. In Saudi Arabia, the oil states, the areas where the oil is, are dominated by the Shia. There's no Wahhabi majority in Saudi Arabia. So that makes all these people nervous.
I know in Pakistan there's been a history of anti-Shia violence. Processions are attacked, mosques are burned, and the like.
This is a very recent history, David. This is something which began in the 90s, late 80s and 90s. It never existed in the past before. The Shias were part of the Muslim community. Shia generals rose to quite big positions inside the army and inside the civil service. There were no big problems. This is the development of Salafism and Wahhabism and religious extremism in Pakistan, which is so sectarian that it regards Shias as non-Muslims. Says, how can they be Muslims? They believe in these imams. We don't. Islam doesn't believe. Islam believes Allah and Prophet. That's all. Nothing else between them, which technically, of course, whether we like it or not, is accurate if you study the theology. So they say that these people are not Muslims. They are apostates, etc., and should be wiped out.
And that's the Wahhabi position in Saudi Arabia.
That is the Wahhabi position in Saudi Arabia, and it's a crazy position. I mean, even as we're talking today, the Iranian President Ahmadinejad has arrived in Riyadh and has been welcomed by the Saudi king to discuss Iraq. So deep down they all know that these are divisions that are used for other purposes and in themselves matter very little.
Just a couple of more questions. There's been a persistence of so-called theories about the events of September 11th, 2001. The Guardian recently says in a report that more than 1/3 of Americans believe that either the official version of events never happened, or that U.S. officials knew the attacks were imminent but did nothing to stop them. And there's a documentary being circulated on the internet called Loose Change, which apparently has been seen by millions around the world. I encountered people who have seen this documentary in Iran on my trip to that country. Do you encounter this in your talks and in your travels? People have these ideas?
I encounter this, but largely in the United States, I have to say, that, I'm giving a talk and at the end it's question time. And a plaintive voice was him, Tariq, do you believe we did it ourselves? And, this has been happening since 9/11. And I've argued in my book, Clash of Fundamentalisms, and I carry on arguing that no, this was not an action carried out by the United States itself. That it's a sign of total alienation from reality to believe that the United States carried out the attacks on the Twin Towers and hit the Pentagon. And then, of course, the conspiracists say, but the Pentagon wasn't really hit. And, there are numerous theories which are developed, which I find sort of psychologically interesting but politically worthless. Psychologically, they're interesting as to why do people fall in love with these theories. Well, in the United States, there is a deep distrust and mistrust of government, and for good reasons, because this government, or not this government, but historically, many governments have lied in order to get their way. But I don't think any government in the United States has actually carried out actions of this sort against its own country. They haven't done it, and it's be crazy of them to do so. Because the one thing about the United States is that it's difficult to keep things totally secret. And if this had happened, it would come out sooner or later. And if it actually happened, it would discredit the entire structure of the American system, of politics in this country. But secondly, people feel that there are certain aspects of the hits of which they have not been informed. This is probably true, David. I mean, I certainly don't accept any of these conspiracy theories which says the United States organized these hits. Why should it? I mean, why the hell should it? It needs excuses to go and make wars. It never needed them before. It's bizarre. But it is true that probably we aren't being given the whole truth. And we know for a fact that there were warnings being circulated. And there's the other thing which was in all the papers and then disappeared. The famous story of the Israelis who were standing filming the Twin Towers being attacked from a van. And of that there is some evidence. But even if that is true, so what? I mean, maybe we don't know. So there are some unanswered questions. In the Muslim world, it's a different thing. It's a sort of, one is a blind anti-Americanism, not being able to see that, the United States hasn't done that. The second is, of course, an element of self-denigration, which is that we aren't intelligent enough to have done this. I remember soon after 9/11, I was approached after talks by people. I was stopped, quite intelligent people. These were not sort of middle-class doctors and teachers would stop me on the street after I'd given a talk. They were slightly ashamed of saying this in public, but they would take me to one side and say, do you really think that we were capable of doing it? I said, they said, mentally capable. And I said, well, actually, the fact that this group did it shows that they were mentally not very strong, because it's a foolish thing to have done. It hasn't strengthened them or their cause, it's weakened it, but they will realize that one day. But I said, yeah, technically they're perfectly capable of doing it. After all, the guys who trained these people as pilots said they didn't want to know how to take off or land, but how to fly a plane in midair. So I said they knew what they were doing, and that certainly any fool can do. It's not a big thing. that. And then the other argument comes up, but can this one guy sitting in his cave in the Afghan... I said that's got nothing to do with that. These are middle-class, trained people, skilled people. These are not peasants who've carried these acts out. They're educated graduates. In the sciences, in medicine, in engineering, it's a sort of political act which they've carried out. They're wrong, but they did carry it out. There's no dispute about that. And they've admitted it. I mean, that's the other thing. And then you say to these conspiracists, but how come Osama and these people all now say, yeah, it was our people who carried it out? Then they say, oh, well, but who are these people working for? So you then get into a double and triple conspiracy thesis. And it's also a sign of weakness, in my opinion, that these conspiracy theories are so dominant. It's a sign of weakness, failure, and desperation on the part of people who are very hostile to these wars and occupations, can't do anything else, and so up the ante on this front. Why aren't you so worked up about what's happening in Iraq? Why don't you constantly maintain a barrage of propaganda on the streets against that war and the killings there, instead of spending so much time and energy on these conspiracy theories? That's a question these people should be asking themselves. Even if they were right, they should be against the war in Iraq.
Well, do you think there's a racist factor at work here, that, those 3,000 Americans were killed on September 11th?
Well, yeah, I mean, they were Americans, but, as we know, there were Indians there were a few Pakistanis there working in Twin Towers, but of course the empire, when an American dies, it means much more than anywhere else. I mean, it's a story I recounted in Clash of Fundamentalisms of a taxi driver, his SUV festooned with stars and stripes, who, when I asked in October that year, why he was festooned with stars and stripes and what he thought about the whole thing. Once he realized that I wasn't an American, he said to me he was pleased it had happened. He was from Central America, and so many of their people had been killed by pro-American governments that now they know what it feels like. And I tried to tell him, but this is not going to get anywhere. And he said, yeah, I know, but I still feel happy. So there is and Latin America is the place where it was received the biggest support. The Muslim world was in a state of shock because they knew what was coming.
I asked Seymour Hersh, who's based in Washington, D.C., if he had looked at this, these so-called theories, and he told me, better believe I've looked at it. This would be the biggest story in the history of the world. And he said there's no traction there. I mean, there's some, yes, unexplained coincidences or things that are not clear, but it would be impossible, he said, in his view, for an operation of this kind to be leak-proof, to be contained. So that's Cy Hersh. And just to add something, I gave a talk in San Diego at the University of California there, and I was asked in the question and answer period, what I thought about these theories, and I said I don't find them very credible, and I was asked, well, why don't you do programs on them? And I said I just don't find that there's enough substance there. After the talk, as inevitably happens, people come up to you, and these three very bright, intelligent Lebanese students came up, spoke in perfect English, and they said, Mr. Barsamian, we know for a fact that the Arabs were not involved in the September 11th attacks. And I said, wow, this is important information. I mean, what can you tell me? They said, I'm not fabricating this. They said it would be impossible for Arabs to coordinate such an attack where they would have to get to the airport to get on 4 different flights. That was the intellectual understanding of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, I agree with Cy Hersh. There is absolutely no evidence of U.S. involvement on this, and it would be more than the bigger story. I mean, it's not journalism we're interested in. It would create a total crisis for the American ruling elite. It's not true, so we shouldn't waste too much time on it. And I think people come up with all sorts of explanations as to why it wasn't the people who did it. It's a foolish waste of time, and it detracts from the real world. and what is going on in the real world. And I say to all these conspiracy theorists, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. Why aren't you worked up about what's going on there? That's what you should be concerned about.
As Kashmir is an ongoing issue separating Pakistan and India, the issue of the Armenian genocide lingers 90-plus years since it happened in 1915 in Ottoman Turkey. On January 16th, 2007, a very prominent, one would say the most prominent figure in the the most prominent figure in the Turkish-Armenian community, Hrant Dink, an independent journalist, was murdered in the streets of Istanbul. Nobel Prize winner Orhan Pamuk has been threatened because he has spoken about the Armenian genocide. Another writer and academic, Elif Shafak, has also been threatened because Turkish nationalists are very unhappy with this the raising of this issue. What is your take on this, and why can't there be an understanding or some kind of rapprochement?
I think there are two or three related factors here. One is that, of course, the national state created by Kemal Atatürk came to power and assumed, or the people even before them, the young Turks under whom the genocide was carried out of the Armenians, assumed that the only way a national state would survive and be created in Turkey was by removing all extraneous forces. And the Armenians were a large, old, established community, especially in eastern Turkey. But of course that imploded because the fact that Turkey became largely a Muslim state after the expulsion of the Greeks, the genociding of the Armenians, etc., didn't save it from that. I mean, the killing of the fight of the Kurds for their own autonomy, the fight with the Turkish government over that meant that this problem couldn't go away. And it's now ironic, when you look back on it, that they did this because I said this in Diyarbakir, where I was in eastern Turkey, last year, that if the Armenians, I said this to some of the Kurds who are ultra-nationalists and supporting the Iraq war, I said, of course, your forefathers wiped out the Armenians, which was a big tragedy, because if the Armenians had still been part of eastern Turkey, how could you have spoken of Kurdistan? Because they were a majority. Certainly in Diyarbakir they were. The non-Kurds were a majority, and in other parts. So you would have been forced to live together and not become narrow nationalists. And of course there's no reply to that. So there are all sorts of contradictions in how and why that happened, but it was the deadly logic of ultranationalism. That's how it works in most parts of the world when people go down that route. Why they don't admit it? One, because for a long, long time they were ultra-defensive about it. Now I think the events are so far removed that there is a section of the Turkish elite and political class which would probably admit it. I once said to a senior Turkish civil servant, why don't you admit it and apologize? You didn't do it, but say those who did it it was reprehensible, unacceptable, we apologize, we welcome Armenians to come back and see their villages, etc., etc. He was very blunt with me. He said, we cannot afford to pay money out. If you accept the use of the word genocide, then thanks to what the Germans in the reparation agreements with the Israelis over the Holocaust, we are lumbered forever. We just don't have the funds to do that. I said, he said, I am telling you, do not underestimate what I'm telling you. So I said, so what if you referred to it as the mass organized killings of Armenians that took place and were carried out by Kurdish irregulars were a tragedy, we apologize for them. He said if that was the wording, I think you'd find many people in Turkey would accept it. Now, I don't know. But in any event, the killing of this journalist, the hounding out of Pamuk, is a terrible tragedy for Turkey. Not for these guys as individuals. One's dead, unfortunately. If Turkey can't come to terms with its past, it's a tragedy. But let me tell you one other thing. The talk I gave in Diyarbakir was at a cultural center. The woman who ran the cultural center, we were having dinner before my talk. And she said to me, and I, of course, because I'd gone and seen the old city, seen the spaces, the old churches, I was quite obsessed, wanting to reconstruct it in my own mind, because after all, I'm also a novelist. And I asked her, do people talk about it? And she said that a woman called Fatima Chetin had just written a book called My Grandmother, which, by the way, Verso is going to publish in English. It's being translated. And how she had discovered that her grandmother was an Armenian woman who had been saved, and how lots of children had been spared and saved and adopted by Kurdish families, and that these children were referred, she said she was shocked when she found out, as sword leftover children. The children the sword had spared. So she wrote a book called My Grandmother and went to Diyarbakir to present it. And this woman who runs the center told me, the Anadolu Center, she said it was a large meeting and not the normal intellectuals who come, but large numbers of women from all over the area came, and each had a story. You have an Armenian grandmother? I too. But we were not allowed to talk about it. And this woman herself told me that her grandmother was Armenian. So there are lots of stories coming out. And the reason for those killings was to drive out a population. It wasn't in the sense that they are inferior. Do you see, it wasn't racial but ethnic. They didn't say the Armenians are inferior to us because they married lots of their women. And that was fine. But the killings took place, reasons of nationalism and reasons of property. The Kurds were much poorer. They are amongst the poorer sections of the community. And many Kurds grew very rich from the Armenian estates, lands that they had stolen. And the great Turkish writer, Yasser Kemal has written in many of his novels about what was done by Kurdish militias to the Armenians. So it's something which is accepted and which needs to be done. But I mean, I would, argue that the Turks should go and say publicly the killings took place. If they don't want to use the word genocide, they should just make that statement and let's see where it goes.
We have time for one last question.
You're now interested in a topic you're calling the human rights industry. What's that about?
Well, it's the use of human rights. Obviously, we're all in favor of rights, for people. But all rights are juridical rights. They have to be fought for and won. But an industry has grown up since the end of communism which uses the concept of human rights, humanitarian interventions, military humanism, essentially as the new ideology of the post-communist world and to cater to the needs of the American empire. So this has developed and mushroomed. If you go to American campuses, there are human rights departments. You never had them before, so you have to ask, how come at this particular time in American history that these developed? Why didn't Harvard create a Center for Human Rights in the 19th century, when the memory of the Indians that had been wiped out was fresh in American minds? Why now? And this is a question which fascinates me because of the use that is being made of this. And I call it the human rights industry after Norman Finkelstein, whose parents were in Auschwitz. wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry, which is the uses that are made of the Holocaust in order to justify A, B, and C. And that, in my opinion, is something which is happening with the human rights industry today, both on an ideological level and in the mushrooming of NGOs and non-governmental organizations all over the world. These are organizations which I have referred to as WGOs, Western governmental organizations, planted in different parts of the world with money from Western foundations and governments, which have bought over a large layer of the intelligentsia in many countries, and which remind me of the activities of the Congress for Cultural Freedom during the Cold War, all the money the CIA poured into creating magazines, etc. And this is something which is not discussed often enough, but it needs to be discussed simply to make available an alternative view of this, because people say, but how can you be opposed to human rights? Well, we're not opposed to them, we're opposed to the use that is being made of them, and the grotesque